Hello and welcome to Book Club. Coming to you this month from the Barbican Centre in the City of London, where we're joined by an author who's found the writer's life taking him into particularly inhospitable territory. Our novelist this month is Salman Rushdie. Our book, which has been adapted into a stage play currently being performed here at the Barbican, is Midnight's Children, taking us back to an earlier era in his writing. It was his second novel. It won the Booker Prize in 1981. It was later voted the Booker of Bookers. Welcome, Salman Rushdie, to Book Club. The book that the group of readers with us today is discussing with the author this month, and I hope many of you, of course, have been reading along with us at home, is a story which, of course, takes as its inspiration that moment of India's birth as an independent nation. That's the midnight, although the complicated story starts really about 30 years later or more, with Salim Sinai apparently approaching death and looking back in a life that mirrored the troubled story of his country. He was one of Midnight's children, the 1,001 who in the story were born within an hour of independence in 1947. Their story is the story of the book, the tragedies, the mysticism, the heroism and the betrayals, the imagination and the tangled politics of a vast and mesmerising country. Now, Salman Rushdie started the book as a history, but it became the story of 3 generations of Salim Sinai's family and everything that accompanied that story. Let me ask you the first question myself. Did it start as a way of telling the history that you wanted to explore personally? And did you find yourself almost unconsciously drawn instead into what became a personal narrative about the characters?
No, it's more or less exactly the other way around, in the sense that I started out long before I knew that it would have this big public dimension, this great, that the architecture of the novel would have something to do with the kind of period of history. I just started off thinking I wanted to write a novel which arose out of my memory of childhood in Bombay, but a novel about childhood. And I had this idea about having a child who was born at the exact moment of the independence of the country, largely because, I'm slightly older than that. I was born in June of 1947, exactly 8 weeks before the independence of India, to the day. And
so you can't remember it?
No, I don't, not very well. But I remember there being a kind of family joke to the effect that I got born and 8 weeks later the British fled. And I guess that joke became the origin of the novel. Because at some point I thought, well, it doesn't have to be 8 weeks, you could actually make it simultaneous. That's what I had. I had this boy born at midnight at the time that the country became independent, and I had this idea of a novel about childhood. But clearly what happened was that the implications of that coincidence became more and more important as I thought about the book. I thought, well, if you're going to have a child who is in some way the twin of the country, born at the same moment, then you in a way have to tell both the story of both twins. You have to tell the story of the country as well as the story of the child.
And the other motor of the plot, of course, which I didn't mention in the introduction, is the swapping of the babies at that moment of birth, which becomes the key to everything that follows. Much of the history would have been the same, but underneath there's the moment of deception, really. Well,
it's a kind of deliberately kind of Hindi movie idea, a kind of Bollywood melodramatic idea, because the novel is a lot about disappointed hopes, of directions not taken, of lives that might have been one thing which become another thing, and it was just a way of crystallizing that, the idea of the baby swap.
Explain how the baby swap works.
Well, there are these 2 kids who one of whom is the child of a rich family and one of whom is the child of a poor family, and they're both getting born at that moment of independence. And, the hospital obviously is a sort of stage of some chaos as well, because it's a generally chaotic moment. One of them is being born down in the kind of cheap public ward, and another is in a private room. But at a kind of key moment, there's one particular nurse in the hospital who has a lover who is a rather politically radical chap who has been persuading her that what really matters is not the independence of India from Britain, but a kind of revolution of the rich against the poor. He's a kind of rather Marxist figure. And to try and please her lover, she decides on her own personal little political act, which is to swap the babies, to change the name tags on the 2 babies. And so the rich child has the poor family and the poor child gets sent to the rich family, and their lives are exchanged forever. And they don't know. And one of the things about one of the sort of tensions in the novel is whether they're going to find out, and if so, how.
How did people approach the book in the first place? Did it feel like a commentary on history or a wonderfully human story, or did people naturally take the two as intertwined?
I have to admit, I felt like a bit of a fraud reading the book to start with, because I was completely ignorant of the history. And I just wanted to ask, how was the book perceived differently in the UK and in the subcontinent? I mean, I know you've been described over here as a magical realist and kind of lumped in with all of those people. Is it perceived in the same way in India?
When it came out, it really was very differently received amongst Indian readers and amongst non-Indian readers. When it came out here and in Europe and in America, the people tended to stress the imaginative elements of the book, the fantasy elements of the book, and so on. In India, or amongst Indian readers, people tended to read it like a history book. It was very different. I mean, I remember going to India just after the book came out and doing public readings and things in various cities. And I remember in Bombay, somebody came up to me and said, he said, I could have written that book. I know all that stuff. and
what did you say in response?
Well, I said, thank you. On both levels, people responded to it as either personal or political history, because there were also, in Bombay particularly, a number of people who absolutely insisted that they had been models for characters, when in most cases I'd never met them. And I remember a lady came up to me at this same reading and kind of smacked me on the arm and said, naughty boy. She said, I know you did it, but never mind, I forgive you. I said, excuse me, what's your name? But occasionally people did correctly identify themselves. I had these two childhood friends who were very different in their family background and so on than the characters of Ice Slice and Hair Oil, Sabarmati in the novel. But the thing they had in common with the brothers in the book is that you would never have believed they were brothers. They didn't look like each other at all. And one was very, very neat and tidy and always had his hair very tidily oiled and parted. And the other one was a sort of constant mess, the curly hair all over the place and shirts hanging out and jam on his tie and so on. So I always thought it was amazing that people so different should actually be brothers. And so I used them.
This business of characterisation is interesting because people who know the book will know that it teems with these larger-than-life characters. I know you're a great admirer of Dickens, and I don't wish to flatter you unduly by this comparison, but the Dickensian method with these extraordinary casts of people who pour over the horizon and represent all kinds of things but have a life of their own is one that attracts you as a novelist.
Yeah, lots about Dickens attracts me as a novelist. First of all, the Dickensian city. The way of creating these...
Rather like Bombay.
Yeah, these teeming, rotting cities, of Dickensian England have a really close affinity to contemporary India. Very easy to recognise the Bombay that I grew up in the London that David Copperfield inhabits. But against that very naturalistic background, he will project amazing ideas. The Circumlocution Office, a government department that exists to do nothing, which we, obviously believe to be true, but it's, of course, a completely fantasy idea.
Spontaneous combustion.
Yes, a court case that never ends. Jarndyce versus Jarndyce, a court case that simply never ends, goes on for generations, which anybody who's been involved in a court case knows the feeling, but that's a completely Garcia Marquez idea, if you know what I mean, to push it to that level of absurdity.
First, you talked about the Indian perspective, and then I've got a very, I think, English perspective, and you've gone on to sort of talk about the Englishness of it a bit, but would you agree that Salim could be seen as a quintessentially English narrator, sort of comic unreliability, his pomposity sort of deflated by the real account or historical account and his own account, and how I view him as basically a sort of bastard son of Tristram Shandy? Mm-hmm.
I think that's right. I think there's obviously a kind of echo of Tristram Shandy in Salim. Yeah, I think that's fair enough. And I think
he gets things wrong, and he
gets things wrong, and he takes a long time to be born.
That business of the clock.
There's a wonderful moment near the end of the first volume of Tristram Shandy in which the narrator tells you that it's now taken him a year to tell you about the first few days of his life, so he now has more to tell you about than he had when he started.
And you close the
book. And yes, he is an unreliable narrator in that there are clearly some things he gets wrong about memory. But I think there's one way in which he's not a Western narrator at all, in the sense that he also the way in which he speaks and the way in which he tells the story comes a lot out of my memory of and knowledge of the Indian oral tradition of stories. And watching, particularly in South India, watching oral storytellers in Kerala and other places telling stories to large audiences. And the manner in which they told the story was one which was very attractive to me because it was not at all linear narrative. The advice given by the caterpillar to Alice in Wonderland, which was start at the beginning, go on till you reach the end, and then stop. That's not what they do. They interweave and play with a number of different elements, mythological, personal, political, kind of scatological, and weave them all into their narrative.
And it's different every time, isn't it?
And it's different every time. And of course, they have the absolute imperative of pleasing the audience, because if the audience doesn't like it, it gets up and walks away.
And the other way that you keep people there, surely, is by linking character and place. You talked about Bombay as being the Dickensian city of your youth. But that linkage between character and place is terribly important in the book.
Yeah. This is a sort of comic passage, but one of the things we were saying about Salim is this idea of him being in some way twinned with India. And as you know, he has certain rather unfortunate physical characteristics, like a very big nose and so on. And
you describe it as a cucumber, don't you?
Yes, but in this way, here we discover that his face has another characteristic, which is that, well, I won't spoil the joke, but he's in geography class here. Human geography, Zagallo announces. This is what? Kapadia? Please, sir, don't know, sir. Filth from the jungle. He buffets Jimmy Kapadia, begins to twist an ear casually. Stay in class sometimes, find out. Ow, 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 yes, sir, sorry, sir. 6 hands are waving, but Jimmy's ear is in danger of coming off. Heroism gets the better of me. Sir, please stop, sir, he has a heart condition, sir. Which is true, but the truth is dangerous because now Zagallo is rounding on me. So, a little arguer, is it? And I am being led by my hair to the front of the class. So, answer the question. You know what is human geography? Pain fills my head, obliterating all notions of telepathic cheatery. Aye, sir, no, sir, ouch! And now it is possible to observe a joke descending on Zagallo, a joke pulling his face apart into the simulacrum of a smile. It's possible to watch his hand darting forward, thumb and forefinger extended, to note how thumb and forefinger close around the tip of my nose and pull downwards. See, boys, you see what we have here. Regard, please, the hideous face of this primitive creature. It reminds you of? And the eager response is, Sir, the devil, sir. Please, sir, one cousin of mine. No, sir, a vegetable, sir. I don't know which. Until Zagallo, shouting above the tumult, Silence, sons of baboons. This object here, a tug on my nose, this is human geography. How, sir? Where, sir? What, sir? Zagallo is laughing now. You don't see, he guffaws, in the face of this ugly ape, you don't see the whole map of India? Yes, sir. No, sir. You show us, sir. See here. The Deccan Peninsula hanging down. Again, ouch, my nose. Sir, if that's the map of India, what are the stains, sir? It is Gladney Keith Kalako feeling bold, sniggers, titters from my fellows, and Zagallo taking the question in his stride. These stains, he cries, are Pakistan. This birthmark on the right ear is the east wing, and this horrible stained left cheek, the west. Remember, stupid boys, Pakistan is a stain on the face of India. Ho, ho, the class laughs. Absolute master joke, sir. But now my nose has had enough. Staging its own unprompted revolt against the grasping thumb and forefinger, it unleashes a weapon of its own. A large blob of shining goo emerges from the left nostril to plop into Mr. Zagallo's palm. Fat Purse Fishwala yells, Look at that, sir! The drip from his nose, sir! Is that supposed to be Ceylon?
It takes you right back into the book. You're listening to Book Club on Radio 4 with Salman Rushdie talking about Midnight's Children.
I wanted to say, when I first read the book, I'd just come back from a holiday in India and, just been to Kashmir, and the book opens with a scene in Kashmir. And what was really wonderful was you had created a new language, hearing sort of words of Hindi or names which were kind of like puns, Padma, the dung goddess, or space piece of the moon. I liked all that aspect of the book. And as somebody who's sort of grown up in the UK, I can't say that I'm deeply familiar with Indian history. You know, I can sort of recognize the very bold references, but I don't think I can get the kind of most subtle elements of it. But I enjoyed it for the language, really. And
well, I'm glad, because in the end, if a book is going to survive, it survives because of its sentences. I did feel that a lot of what I was trying to do was a language project. I had read a lot of books about India in English, written both by Indian writers and by Western writers. And one of the things, with very few exceptions, one of the things they all seemed to have in common was that they were written in kind of standard English. They were written in a kind of classicist, Forstierian English. And that didn't mean they weren't good books. I mean, I think, that the works of R.K. Narayan, for example, are wonderful books. Anita Desai's earlier novels and so on. I mean, I'm not trying to denigrate the books, but what they had in common was a linguistic classicism and coolness. And I thought, well, if there's one thing that India is not, it's classical and cool. I mean, it's hot and vulgar and crowded and 25 things at once. How do you have a language that sounds like that? That was my problem, that I read these books and they didn't sound to me like the place I knew. So the question was how to create a language that echoed that more tumultuous, I mean, let's say urban reality, because I'm talking about urban India. I'm not talking about the kind of small-town India of Narayan.
If you were trying to capture India in that way and also capture your childhood and any childhood in India, would you say this book is a love letter to India or a farewell note? Are you trying to get it out of your system or not?
No, it wasn't a farewell. It was. Salim says at one point late in the book that he describes the book as an act of love, and that's certainly something that I also thought. It was really a piece of reclamation. I mean, at the time that I wrote the book, second half of the 70s, I mean, it was written in the first and only moment at which India abandoned democracy for a period of time. And actually, I started writing the book before the emergency finished. I was writing the book in 77 to 1980, sort of around there. And I was very grateful, actually, when Mrs. Gandhi lost the election, because it gave me an end to the novel, because otherwise I hadn't quite known how to end it. And I was living in London, and although I still had family and friends in India and I would visit, I hadn't lived there, for a long time. And I thought I'd better get it back for myself, in a way that the writing Midnight's Children was a way of getting it back for myself. The novel is about a city built on reclaimed land, and the novel, in some way, itself is built on reclaimed land, for me.
I wanted to ask you a bit about the language. We've said that it captures the noise and bustle and sounds of India. What about the English language? I mean, I tend now to think that it's no longer a foreign language. It's just another Indian language, but it's used in a particular way, wouldn't you say?
Well, I think it's interesting, isn't it, that English and Urdu, as the language of the last two colonizing powers, are the two languages in India that don't have a regional basis. And in terms of just let's say the narrow level of the writing of novels, in a country where literacy levels are low, you can rule out as a potential audience a large proportion of the population anyway, because they don't read, let alone read literary novels. So when you're talking about the audience for literature, you're really talking about the university-educated class. And now in India that's very large. I mean that's probably getting on for 200 million people now, and oddly that class has been educated in English. That has been the medium of education. So as an Indian writer in English, you are able to be read everywhere in India by the class of people that reads novels. Whereas no matter how great a regional writer you may be, you are imprisoned in the language. If you're a Bengali writer, you're not going to find a lot of Tamil readers. And what I think about English as a language is that its great gift to writers is its incredible malleability, incredible flexibility. You can do almost anything to English and it still makes sense.
Do you think that we can express our deepest Indian feelings, the way that Indians look at the world, in English?
Well, I think it's beginning to be possible to argue that the answer to that is yes. Now that there is this sudden flood of interesting writing in English, in many, many different voices. It's a young literature, the literature in English. You can't say that the case is finally proven or not proven, but I think it's beginning to seem as if the answer is yes. And one of the things I thought, comparing it to my mother tongue, which is Urdu, and my knowledge of Hindi and so on, is that Indian languages are more naturally metaphorical than English. For example, if you want to say the sun rises in English, you say the sun rises, and the verb you're using has to do with movement, But if you're going to say the same thing in Urdu, you say the sun wakes up, But nobody hears it as that. They hear it as the sun rises. But actually the verb you're using is the verb for waking up, So at that kind of absolutely casual, everyday level, there is a common use of metaphor to a much greater degree than English uses it normally. And it's one of the things I tried to shovel in, to try and make English more metaphorical. I mean, I think there is an issue which is somewhat heated in India about the fact that the writers in English tend to get more attention internationally, and I mean that's so. I mean, I happen to think, and I've argued somewhat controversially, that one of the reasons for that is that what's happening in Indian writing in English is currently just about the most interesting thing happening in Indian writing, and obviously there are people who don't agree with that, particularly if they're not writing in English. I mean, this is not a great moment in Hindi literature, frankly.
Can I ask you about the structure of the book? Because I'm fascinated that when we get to Alpha and Omega, you tell us this is exactly the halfway point of the story. Mm-hmm. And as a reader, I'm thinking, well, that means he has it all very carefully worked out. He knows precisely where he's been, where he's going. Is that how you write?
Well, no, it's messier than that. That's the truth. But you try and give the impression of not being messy, because you can cheat, you can put that in at the end. And I've always believed that the day in which I started experimenting with Salim's voice was the day I became a writer. It was an amazing moment, and I really didn't know where it came from fully,
So the role of the narrator is the key question that a novelist has to confront.
For this book, I mean, the fact that the way of organising this 60-year story with a cast of thousands ended up being the voice of Salim. I mean, that's the thing that made the book work, that pulled it together, and that everything was seen through his sensibility and through his particular way of thinking.
And yet he's unreliable.
Because none of us remember things accurately. You put two people who've both been to the same public event and ask them to say what they saw, they don't see the same thing. So, and they can disagree dramatically about what they saw.
Memory, in other words, is more important than history.
Yeah. And that was a view of the book which changed. Let's say I had started off with, I guess, a slightly more Proustian idea, of the kind of recapturing of lost time and bringing it back as if it had never gone away. And then my view sort of changed, and I thought, no, the idea of the filter of memory, the thing that Proust tries to get rid of, that filter was actually more interesting to me. The errors of memory are a way in which we make up the past.
In Shame, you wrote that Pakistan's women are more impressive than its men.
That's only because the men are very unimpressive.
I agree, being a Pakistani woman. But in Midnight's Children, the women are again, I think, more impressive than the men. The men are riddled with insecurities and self-doubt, and yet the women, Naseem, Mumtaz, Padma, all of them, they're really strong. Is that your experience of Indian women?
Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely it is. I mean, I come from a family of women, there's almost no boys in my family. I mean, I'm an only son. I have three sisters. My three sisters, between them, haven't produced a male child. I mean, I have. My father was an only son. You go back generations and generations. There's almost no boys. And the women in my family are very unlike the kind of meek, mild stereotype of the recessive Indian woman. I mean, these are very competent, able, noisy, opinionated, loud-mouthed, smart women, and if you don't have anything interesting to say, you're going to get shouted down very fast. I had an endless array of aunts, of a kind of Bertie Wooster aunt power.
Surging sea of aunts.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. I had the equivalents of Aunt Dahlia and Aunt Agatha.
What a thought!
I mean, I have found it very natural to write that kind of Indian female character because they were the people I grew up with and the people I knew.
Salman, I've been sort of thinking whether there could be a kind of sequel, Midnight's, I wouldn't call it pensioners.
Grandchildren.
But just wondering what kind of things can they expect in the years to come?
I've never thought about a direct sequel because I think often, they're just like revisiting something that you did better before, and it's probably better just to leave those questions to people's own wonderings, But I remember when the book came out, if there was a criticism of it in India, it was that the ending was too pessimistic. I mean, the truth is that what's happened in India since the book came out is so much darker than anything that the book foresaw, that the ending of the book now looks to be ludicrously optimistic. And it's a real shift that the passage of time has wrought in the way in which the book is read. I mean, I'd write a less funny book, I think, if I was writing about the last 20 years. But there's one character, at least, in Midnight's Children who has a quite substantial afterlife in another one of my novels, which is the character of of Salim's son, who is, of course, not really his son, although he is, of course, the grandchild of his grandparents. That child, who, if you remember, is born late in the novel and has, unlike Salim, doesn't have a big nose, instead he has big ears. Well, he recurs in The Moor's Last Sigh, having grown up, and the big ears are now not, the ears of Ganesh, the elephant god, but they're kind of satellite dishes. And he grows up into this kind of Bombay yuppie. And I think was actually rather satisfying for me revisiting of a previous character. And in some ways, I think of The Moor's Last Sigh as being a companion volume to Midnight's Children, because it comes out of a later period, different sort of city, and also because its motivation was not childhood. It comes out of my grown-up experience of India and of Bombay.
Salman Rushdie, thank you very much indeed for being our guest on this month's book club.